Custer's 3 days before Little Bighorn. Battle strategy revealed. The Battle of Little Bighorn is known as one of the most famous and controversial battles in history. But how did Custer prepare for the fight? And how did his overconfidence lead to such a devastating defeat? Join us as we unravel the critical moments and decisions that paved the way for disaster. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more fascinating historical insights. Earlier on June 22, 1876, George Armstrong Custer sat in his tent, alone with his thoughts, brooding over the conversation he had earlier with General Alfred Terry. The discussion weighed heavily on his mind, particularly one suggestion that he found deeply unsettling, that someone else might lead the 7th Cavalry in the upcoming campaign. For Custer, this was more than just an operational suggestion. It was an affront to his pride and reputation. He had led this regiment for years, through countless battles and skirmishes, and the idea that command could be handed over to someone else was unbearable. The conversation with Terry had revolved around the best course of action for the impending battle against the Sioux and Cheyenne. Terry, being the overall commander of the campaign, had a wider view of the situation. He presented Custer with an alternative plan, one that involved Major Marcus Reno taking a more central role in leading the 7th Cavalry, allowing Custer to oversee the operation from a higher vantage point. Terry likely saw this as a way to ensure that the entire campaign was well coordinated, but to Custer, it felt like a challenge to his authority. Custer had always been confident in his leadership, but the mere suggestion that Reno could take command cast doubt in his mind. He respected Reno as a soldier, but there had always been tension between them. Custer had long questioned Reno's ability to make quick, decisive decisions in the heat of battle. Reno was more cautious, more deliberate, and Custer feared that this hesitation could cost them dearly when the fighting began. As Custer sat in his tent, his mind returned to the exchange with Terry. Terry had tried to persuade him that handing over some control to Reno might be beneficial. Custer, however, was not convinced. His thoughts turned darker as he imagined Reno hesitating at a critical moment, allowing the Sioux to regroup or escape. That kind of mistake could turn the tide of the battle, and in Custer's mind, it was a risk he wasn't willing to take. Custer had built his career on bold moves and aggressive tactics. He had led daring charges, often putting himself at the front of the action, and his men followed him with unwavering loyalty. That was how he believed wars were won, not by cautious maneuvers, but by seizing the moment and overwhelming the enemy before they had a chance to react. It was how he had achieved victory at the Battle of Washita in 1868, and he was determined to repeat that success here. Terry's suggestion that Reno might be better suited for leading the cavalry only reinforced Custer's determination. He couldn't allow anyone else to take control, especially not someone like Reno, who he felt didn't have the same instincts for battle. To Custer, leadership wasn't just about following orders. It was about having the courage to take risks and inspire the men around you to do the same. In the silence of his tent, Custer's thoughts grew more resolute. He would not step aside, and he would not let Reno lead the 7th Cavalry. His pride, his reputation, and his sense of responsibility to his men demanded that he take full control of the operation. He believed that no one could lead the regiment as effectively as he could, and he wasn't about to let anyone else try. At some point during his contemplation, one of his aides approached the tent, asking if Custer had any further orders for the night. Custer, lost in thought, simply waved the aide away. His decision was made. He would lead the regiment, and no one else would take that role from him. There was no need for further discussion. Custer's concerns weren't just about Reno's leadership style. He was also deeply aware of the growing size of the Sioux and Cheyenne forces. Reports from scouts suggested that the enemy village was larger than expected, and there were increasing signs that the native forces were well organized and prepared for battle. Custer knew that they needed to act quickly. Time was running out, and any delay could allow the Sioux and Cheyenne to disperse, making it nearly impossible to achieve a decisive victory. Yet, despite the growing challenges, Custer remained confident. He had led his men through difficult battles before, and he believed in their ability to follow his lead. His regiment trusted him, and he had never let them down. As he looked around the camp that evening, seeing the silhouettes of his soldiers moving quietly among the tents, preparing for the days ahead, Custer felt a deep connection to them. These were his men, and he was their leader. There was no other option but for him to take command. Custer's decision wasn't just about personal pride. It was about his understanding of how the battle would be won. He believed that victory could only be achieved through swift, decisive action. The Sioux and Cheyenne were formidable opponents, but Custer was convinced that if he could strike hard and fast, using his tried-and-true tactics, he could catch them off guard and force them into submission before they had time to regroup. Later that evening, as dusk settled over the camp on June 22, 1876, Custer called a meeting with his officers. The day had been filled with decisions, and now it was time to explain them to his men. Among the officers present were Captain Godfrey and Lieutenant Gibson, both experienced and respected within the 7th Cavalry. Custer knew the importance of making sure his officers understood his thinking. The next few days would be critical, and they needed to be aligned with his strategy. Custer gathered them around in the dim light of his tent. His mood was serious yet composed. He had spent much of the day reflecting on the discussion he'd had with General Terry about the upcoming campaign. Now, it was time to explain why he had made certain controversial decisions, particularly the ones regarding the refusal of additional firepower and reinforcements. One of the first points Custer addressed was his decision to leave behind the Gatling guns. These large, powerful weapons had been offered to him as part of the operation. However, Custer had turned them down, and many of his officers were curious, some even concerned, about why he would reject such an asset. The Gatling gun was known for its firepower, capable of unleashing a devastating hail of bullets that could easily overwhelm enemy forces. For many, it seemed like a no-brainer to take the guns into battle. But Custer had a different view. Standing tall in front of his officers, he explained that the Gatling guns were simply too cumbersome for the type of rapid, aggressive warfare he was planning. The guns were heavy, and they required several men and mules to transport them. Custer believed that bringing the guns would slow down his regiment, making them less mobile and limiting their ability to strike quickly. He was focused on speed and maneuverability, key elements of his strategy. In his mind, the slow-moving Gatling guns would only hinder their ability to surprise the Sioux. "There's no time for dragging artillery through this terrain," Custer said firmly, addressing the officers gathered around him. "We need to be fast, and we need to hit them before they can react. The Gatling guns will only slow us down." His tone left little room for debate. Custer's leadership style was well known. He was decisive and direct, and once he had made a decision, he expected his officers to follow through without question. Still, some of the officers exchanged glances, wondering whether leaving behind such powerful weapons was the right call. But none of them voiced their concerns openly. They trusted Custer's instincts, even if they didn't always agree with them. Next, Custer moved on to his second major decision, the refusal of reinforcements from the 2nd Cavalry. General Terry had offered to supplement Custer's forces with additional battalions from the 2nd Cavalry, giving him more men for the upcoming battle. But Custer had also declined this offer. His reasoning was similar to the one he had given for the Gatling guns. Custer believed that more men would mean more logistical challenges. They would require more food, more supplies, and more coordination. In Custer's mind, a larger force would be harder to move swiftly and efficiently. "We have everything we need right here," Custer said, gesturing toward the men resting in the camp outside. "We're already strong enough to take on the Sioux, and I don't want the burden of extra men slowing us down." Custer was confident that his regiment, as it was, could handle the task ahead. He knew the strength of his men, and he trusted their ability to follow his orders with precision. For Custer, adding more troops wasn't necessary. It would only complicate the situation. However, as Custer spoke, there was an underlying tension in the air. Not all of his officers agreed with these decisions, even if they didn't say so outright. Some believed that extra firepower and reinforcements could make a significant difference in the coming battle. But Custer made it clear that the decisions had been made and there would be no turning back. Before ending the meeting, Custer emphasized the importance of unity within the regiment. He knew that divisions among the officers could weaken their effectiveness in battle. While he was aware of the tensions between certain individuals, particularly Benteen and Reno, he stressed that everyone needed to work together if they were going to succeed. Custer made a point of calling for harmony within the regiment, reminding his officers that personal disagreements had no place in the field. "We have one goal here," Custer said firmly, "and that is to win. We must stay united or we risk everything." During the evening officers' meeting on June 22, 1876, Custer addressed the key aspects of the upcoming campaign. As he spoke, underlying tensions began to surface, particularly between him, Captain Frederick Benteen, and Major Marcus Reno. Both officers had a history of strained relations with Custer, and this meeting brought some of those tensions into the open. While discussing strategy, Custer made several remarks that seemed to carry implicit criticism, particularly toward Benteen and Reno, though he did not name them directly. His comments about discipline and loyalty left little doubt that he was addressing some of the officers who had questioned his decisions in the past. Custer said, "I will be glad to listen to suggestions from any officer of the command, if made in proper manner, but I want it distinctly understood that I shall allow no grumbling and shall exact the strictest compliance with orders from everybody, not only mine, but with any order given by an officer to his subordinate." The officers listened in silence, but the atmosphere grew tenser as Custer continued. He referenced a criticism made by a neighboring department commander about another cavalry regiment, saying, "I don't want it said of this regiment, as a neighboring department commander said of another cavalry regiment, that it would be a good one if he could get rid of the old captains and let the lieutenants command the companies." At this point, Benteen, known for speaking his mind, decided to challenge Custer's remarks. He asked Custer directly who he meant by that remark about grumbling. It was a bold question, but Benteen had never been one to avoid confrontation, especially when he felt slighted. Custer, staying calm, replied, "I want the saddle to go just where it fits," a non-committal answer that left the officers wondering exactly who he was targeting with his comments. Not satisfied with this response, Benteen pressed further, asking if Custer had ever heard of any criticisms or grumbling from him personally. Custer, seeing the need to avoid escalating the situation further, reassured Benteen, "No, I never have." Despite this attempt at reassurance, the exchange revealed the underlying tension between the two men. Benteen had long harbored doubts about Custer's aggressive tactics, believing that his recklessness could endanger the entire regiment. While Custer's comments were meant to maintain strict discipline, they also exposed the friction between him and some of his senior officers. Reno, who was also present at the meeting, chose to stay quiet during the exchange. He, too, had his reservations about Custer's leadership, particularly the decision to forgo reinforcements and heavy artillery like the Gatling guns. However, Reno was more reserved than Benteen and preferred not to voice his concerns in front of the other officers. Still, it was well known among the men that Reno shared some of Benteen's doubts. Custer's remarks, while not directly targeting either officer by name, were clearly aimed at establishing authority and quashing any dissent. He wanted it to be known that he expected absolute loyalty and obedience from everyone under his command. Despite the tensions, Custer's message was clear. There would be no room for debate or grumbling, and everyone was expected to follow orders without question. Although Custer tried to reassure Benteen that he wasn't singling him out, the exchange left the officers with lingering doubts. Benteen, though outwardly placated, still felt that his concerns were being dismissed, and Reno's silence only deepened the sense of unease. Both men believed that Custer's aggressive style of leadership, while effective in the past, carried significant risks that might come to a head in the battle they were preparing for. As the meeting concluded, the tension in the air remained palpable. The officers dispersed, each returning to their duties, but the underlying conflicts had not been resolved. Custer had made his position clear, but the rift between him and some of his senior officers, particularly Benteen and Reno, persisted. These tensions, though not openly discussed further that night, would continue to simmer as the regiment moved closer to battle. By June 23, 1876, Custer was facing mounting frustrations, particularly with the logistical challenges of managing the pack train. The train of 175 mules carrying provisions and ammunition had become a significant burden, slowing down the regiment's progress. Unlike General Crook, who had mastered the use of mules in transporting supplies, Custer was far less experienced in this area. He hadn't bothered to learn how to properly train the mules or tie and adjust the packs, and he wasn't about to start now. This lack of knowledge, combined with his insistence on speed, meant that the pack train became both a literal and figurative drag on the regiment, an anchor slowing down an attack force that was supposed to be fast and agile. As the regiment moved deeper into Sioux territory, the mules balked at the rough terrain, making it difficult for the train to keep pace with the rest of the column. Custer, eager to maintain a swift advance, grew increasingly frustrated with the delays. Time was of the essence, and the slow-moving mules were undermining his entire strategy. The mules frequently lost their packs, requiring stops for soldiers to retie and adjust the loads, further slowing down progress. In an effort to address the issue, Lieutenant Edward Matthey was placed in charge of the pack train. Matthey was tasked with improving the efficiency of the train, ensuring that the mules moved as quickly as possible. He worked tirelessly to reorganize the packs and oversee the soldiers managing the animals, but despite his efforts, the challenges persisted. The train continued to slow the regiment's advance, adding hours to their journey each day. Custer's impatience was palpable. His regiment, known for its speed and maneuverability, was being held back by logistical issues that he had little patience for. His focus on the image of swift, decisive action contrasted sharply with the reality of their situation. As the day wore on, the delays caused by the pack train only increased the tension within the regiment, with some officers like Reno and Benteen becoming more vocal in their concerns about Custer's leadership style. Adding to the tension was the fact that Custer and his close followers were identifiable by their distinctive clothing, which further highlighted divisions within the regiment. Custer, always concerned with image, led the column in his white buckskin suit, a nod to the romanticized version of the Old West. He was followed by two flag-bearers, both wearing similar attire. To Custer, buckskin was a symbol of the frontier spirit, even if it was now somewhat impractical. Once favored by trappers and scouts, buckskin had largely fallen out of use in favor of modern clothing made from cotton and wool, which dried faster and was more breathable. Even Sitting Bull, a traditionalist, had adopted a cotton shirt for practical reasons. Yet for Custer, buckskin was more than just clothing, it was part of his persona. His brothers, Tom and Boston, also wore buckskin, as did his brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun, and several of his closest officers, including Captain George Yates, Captain Miles Keogh, Lieutenant James Porter, Lieutenant Algernon Smith, and Lieutenant William Cook. This group of officers, often referred to as the Custer clique, wore their buckskin proudly, even as some in the regiment saw it as pretentious and impractical. Benteen, for one, had no patience for what he viewed as Custer's silliness. He and other more pragmatic officers preferred modern, functional clothing over the romanticized image that Custer cultivated. To them, Custer's obsession with buckskin seemed more about style than substance, especially in the harsh conditions of the campaign. Despite these internal divisions and the ongoing issues with the pack train, Custer remained focused on the mission. His frustration with the logistical delays was evident, but he was determined to keep pushing forward. As June 23rd drew to a close, the regiment set up camp, but the delays with the pack train had already cost them valuable time. The next day, June 24, 1876, dawned with a renewed sense of urgency for Custer and the 7th Cavalry. Still dressed in his white buckskin suit, Custer led the regiment along the Rosebud River, following the trail left by the Sioux. After the previous day's delays with the pack train, Custer was determined to make up for lost time. The regiment continued their pursuit, but the tension within the ranks was undeniable. As some officers quietly questioned Custer's decisions, both strategic and personal. The Arikara Scouts, led by Lieutenant Charles Varnum, were crucial to the success of the operation. Their deep knowledge of the land allowed them to track the movements of the Sioux with precision, and by the morning of June 24th, they began to find fresh signs of a large village. The scouts discovered abandoned teepees and buffalo hides, clear evidence that the Sioux had been camped in the area recently. This discovery was both encouraging and concerning for Custer. On the one hand, the presence of such a large village meant they were on the right path. The Sioux were within reach, and a decisive battle seemed imminent. However, the abandoned shelters suggested that the Sioux might already be on the move, possibly dispersing in anticipation of an attack. Custer's entire strategy depended on catching the village intact, and the thought of the Sioux scattering was enough to put him on edge. The evidence gathered by the scouts painted a picture of a massive village, far larger than Custer had originally anticipated. The size of the buffalo hides, the number of abandoned teepees, and the sheer volume of tracks indicated that the Sioux forces were far greater than the ones Custer had faced at the Battle of Washita. Still, Custer remained confident in his ability to lead his men to victory. His plan relied on speed and surprise, and he pressed the regiment to move faster, hoping to strike before the Sioux could slip away. Despite the urgency, the internal divisions within the regiment were becoming more pronounced. Benteen and Reno, both skeptical of Custer's leadership style, believed that the size of the Sioux village warranted a more cautious approach. Benteen, in particular, was openly critical of Custer's insistence on maintaining the pace, and his disdain for Custer's buckskin attire only added to the tension between the two men. To Benteen, Custer's focus on image symbolized by his white buckskin suit was a distraction from the more pressing concerns of the campaign. As the day progressed, Custer gathered his officers to discuss their next move. The evidence was clear. The Sioux village was massive, and they were getting closer by the hour. Yet the trail also suggested that the village was on the move, raising the possibility that they might scatter before the 7th Cavalry could reach them. Custer, ever the optimist, believed they could still catch the Sioux by surprise, but he knew they needed to move quickly. "We can't afford to stop now," Custer told his officers, his tone filled with urgency. "If they scatter, we lose our chance for a decisive victory." The regiment pushed forward, with the Arikara scouts continuing to lead the way. As they moved deeper into the valley, the signs of the Sioux's presence became even more apparent. The trail was fresh, and the scouts reported that they were getting closer. By evening, as the regiment set up camp along the Rosebud River, Custer knew that they were on the verge of a major confrontation. The tension within the regiment remained high, but Custer's confidence in his plan never wavered. Tomorrow could be the day that defined the entire campaign. At 7:30 a.m. on June 24, 1876, Custer and the 7th Cavalry came upon a significant site, the location of Sitting Bull's famous sun dance. This was where Sitting Bull had performed his sacred ceremony just a few weeks earlier, during which he had a prophetic vision of U.S. soldiers falling into the Lakota camp, foretelling the battle that was now fast approaching. The site was heavy with spiritual significance for the Lakota people, and the remains of the Sundance Lodge, along with the sacred symbols left behind, spoke to the deep connection between the Lakota warriors and their ancestors. However, as Custer observed the remains of the ceremony, he remained outwardly unaffected by the spiritual significance of the place. To the Lakota and Cheyenne, these symbols were reminders of their unity and purpose in defending their land. But to Custer, they were little more than remnants of a native ritual, with no bearing on his military plans. He was a man focused on results, and despite the deeply symbolic nature of the site, he saw no reason to let it influence his strategy. What truly concerned Custer at this moment was the importance of maintaining the element of surprise. Throughout his military career, he had relied on swift, unexpected attacks to overwhelm his enemies, and he believed that this tactic would serve him well once again. Despite the growing signs of the large native force gathering in the area, evidenced by the abandoned shelters and buffalo hides, Custer remained confident that a well-timed surprise attack would give him the upper hand. At this stage, Custer was aware that the Lakota and Cheyenne had gathered in significant numbers. His scouts had reported on the scale of the village, and he had seen evidence of thousands of people on the move. But Custer trusted in the speed and discipline of the 7th Cavalry, believing that if they could strike swiftly, the native warriors would be unable to organize a cohesive defense in time. The key, as always for Custer, was to move quickly and catch the enemy before they had a chance to react. The remains of the Sundance Lodge, along with the spiritual symbols left behind, held no sway over Custer's confidence. He instructed his officers to keep their movements discreet, ensuring that the regiment remained undetected by the Sioux and Cheyenne. Custer had used this strategy before, most notably at the Battle of Washita in 1868, where a surprise attack had led to a decisive victory over a Cheyenne village. He believed that a similar approach would yield similar results here. However, some of Custer's officers, including Benteen and Reno, had expressed concerns about the size of the native force they were facing. Reports from the scouts had indicated that the Sioux and Cheyenne had gathered in far greater numbers than previously expected, and the officers were worried that a frontal assault without reinforcements might be too risky. But Custer brushed off these concerns. He believed that his aggressive tactics, combined with the element of surprise, would lead to victory, just as they had in past engagements. As the regiment advanced, Custer continued to focus on maintaining the advantage of surprise. The success of his plan hinged on striking before the Sioux and Cheyenne could organize a defense, and he was determined not to lose that advantage. He ordered his officers to keep the men quiet and maintain a rapid pace, moving as quickly as the terrain would allow. Despite the growing evidence of the size and strength of the Sioux and Cheyenne forces, Custer remained resolute in his belief that a well-executed surprise assault would break their will to fight. For Custer, the symbols of the Sundance and the spiritual strength of the Lakota were inconsequential. He trusted in his soldiers and his strategy, confident that their discipline and firepower would be enough to overwhelm the native forces. As the regiment continued their march that morning, Custer's mind was fixed on the coming battle. He knew that if they could strike quickly, before the Sioux had a chance to scatter or organize, they could deliver a decisive blow. For Custer, timing was everything, and he was determined not to let any more time slip away. Later that morning, after observing the Sundance site, Custer's scouts continued to report signs of an ever-growing native force ahead. The abandoned teepees and the fresh trails left by the Sioux and Cheyenne suggested that the village they were following was far larger than anyone had anticipated. By 11:30 a.m., the scouts had gathered enough information to confirm that they were tracking a massive village, far larger than the one Custer had faced at Washita 8 years earlier. This realization began to weigh on Custer. Though he had outwardly dismissed the significance of the spiritual symbols left by the Lakota at the Sundance site, he privately acknowledged the growing size of the native force. In a rare moment of candor, Custer remarked to his orderly John Berkman that there are more Indians than we figured. This admission was significant, as it indicated that Custer was becoming increasingly aware of the scale of the challenge ahead. Despite this recognition, Custer's confidence in his ability to execute a successful campaign remained unshaken. He believed that his aggressive approach and the discipline of the 7th Cavalry would still allow them to prevail, even against such overwhelming numbers. Throughout his career, Custer had faced tough odds before, and his boldness had often carried him through. Now, with the stakes higher than ever, Custer doubled down on his strategy. He remained convinced that if he could catch the Sioux by surprise, the sheer shock of his attack would throw them into disarray, allowing his regiment to defeat them in detail before they could organize an effective defense. However, the evidence gathered by the scouts also raised a new concern. The Sioux and Cheyenne were not just stationary, they were on the move. By early afternoon, it became increasingly clear that the village was dispersing. Fresh trails indicated that small groups were already breaking off from the main village, moving in different directions. For Custer, this was a troubling development. His entire plan relied on catching the Sioux while they were still concentrated in one place. If the village scattered before he could strike, his opportunity for a decisive victory would evaporate. This growing sense of urgency led Custer to push his men even harder. The 7th Cavalry needed to reach the village before it could fully disperse. Every hour that passed increased the risk that the Sioux and Cheyenne would slip away, denying Custer the chance to deliver the knockout blow he was hoping for. At 2:30 p.m., after receiving another report from his scouts, Custer gathered his officers for a quick meeting. He made it clear that they needed to move quickly and prepare for an assault. The signs on the trail suggested that the village was still largely intact, but Custer knew they had to act fast. His sense of urgency was palpable as he issued orders to his officers, urging them to press forward and maintain a rapid pace. "We can't afford to stop now," Custer said, his voice filled with urgency. "If they scatter, we lose our chance for a decisive victory." The regiment pushed forward, with the Arikara scouts continuing to lead the way. As they moved deeper into the valley, the signs of the Sioux's presence became even more apparent. The trail was fresh, and the scouts reported that they were getting closer by the hour. By late afternoon, the regiment was closing in on the village. But Custer's concern about the village scattering remained at the forefront of his mind. As the day wore on, Custer's determination to strike quickly grew stronger. He believed that the size of the native force, while daunting, could still be overcome with speed, discipline, and surprise. For Custer, the key to victory was not in numbers but in timing. If they could catch the Sioux before they had fully dispersed, the 7th Cavalry could still deliver a decisive blow. By 5 p.m., the regiment was preparing for the final leg of their march. The scouts reported that they were closing in on the village, but the question remained: would they reach the village in time to launch a successful attack, or would the Sioux scatter before the battle could begin? Custer remained confident, but the growing size of the native forces and the signs of the village dispersing added a layer of complexity to the situation. As the 7th Cavalry prepared for the coming battle, Custer's mind was fixed on one goal: delivering a surprise attack that would shatter the Sioux and Cheyenne forces. The odds were against him, but Custer believed that with the right timing and execution, victory was still within reach. As the day drew to a close on June 24, 1876, Custer was growing increasingly anxious. The 7th Cavalry had been marching for hours, and the reports from the Arikara scouts confirmed what Custer had feared. The Sioux and Cheyenne forces ahead were much larger than he had initially thought. The signs of a massive village were undeniable. Abandoned teepees, buffalo hides, and countless trails all pointed to a large, well-organized force. By 6 p.m., as the regiment prepared to set up camp for the night, Custer was still processing the scale of the enemy they were facing. It was clear that the Sioux and Cheyenne had gathered in overwhelming numbers, possibly in the thousands. This was not the small, fragmented group he had expected to encounter. Instead, it was one of the largest gatherings of native forces in recent history. The estimates now ranged anywhere from 1,500 to 2,500 warriors, a force far larger than Custer had faced at Washita in 1868, where he had fought and defeated a much smaller Cheyenne village. Despite this daunting reality, Custer remained confident in his plan. He had made a brief remark to his orderly John Berkman earlier in the day, acknowledging that there are more Indians than we figured. But this did little to shake his belief that a well-executed surprise attack could still lead to victory. Custer's entire career had been built on bold, aggressive actions, and he was determined to press forward despite the growing odds against him. As the regiment set up camp along the Rosebud River, Custer called a meeting with his senior officers to discuss their next steps. The evidence gathered by the scouts suggested that the Sioux village was still within reach, but there were increasing signs that it might begin to break apart. Fresh trails indicated that small groups of Sioux and Cheyenne were already moving away from the main camp, possibly in anticipation of an attack. For Custer, this was a troubling development. His entire strategy relied on catching the village while it was still concentrated. If the village scattered into smaller groups, it would be much harder to deliver the decisive blow he had planned. Custer's officers, particularly Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, had grown increasingly concerned about the size of the native force. Both men had long harbored doubts about Custer's aggressive tactics, and the scale of the enemy they were facing only deepened their concerns. Reno, known for his cautious approach, had questioned the wisdom of attacking such a large force without additional reinforcements. Benteen, who had been openly critical of Custer's leadership, also expressed reservations about the plan. He believed that Custer was underestimating the strength and resolve of the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. Despite these concerns, Custer remained firm in his decision. He believed that the element of surprise was still their greatest advantage, and he was determined to act quickly before the Sioux could fully scatter. Custer had always relied on speed and shock to overwhelm his enemies, and he was convinced that a rapid assault would shatter the native forces before they had time to organize a proper defense. He instructed his officers to prepare the men for a swift advance the following day, emphasizing the need to move quickly and maintain the element of surprise. The regiment's pace had been slowed by the logistical challenges of managing the pack train, but Custer knew they couldn't afford any more delays. Time was running out, and every hour that passed increased the risk that the Sioux and Cheyenne would slip away. The reports from the scouts indicated that the village was still largely intact, but the fresh trails suggested that they wouldn't remain in one place for long. By 7 p.m., Custer had made his decision. They would move out early the next morning. He believed that if they could strike the village before it had a chance to fully disperse, they could still deliver a crushing blow to the Sioux and Cheyenne forces. The risks were high, but Custer was confident that his plan would succeed. He had led his men into difficult battles before, and he trusted in their discipline and ability to follow orders. As the evening wore on, Custer took some time to speak with Lieutenant Charles Varnum, who had been leading the Arikara scouts throughout the day. Varnum's scouts had been crucial in tracking the movements of the Sioux, and Custer wanted to ensure that they would be ready to guide the regiment at first light. The plan was simple. They would follow the scouts' trail directly to the village and launch a surprise attack before the Sioux could organize a defense. Custer knew that the success of the mission hinged on the element of surprise, and he was determined to make the most of it. By 9 p.m., as the regiment settled in for the night, the tension within the camp was palpable. The men knew that they were on the verge of a major battle, and while Custer's confidence remained unshaken, there was a growing sense of unease among the officers. The size of the Sioux and Cheyenne forces, combined with the possibility of the village scattering, added a layer of complexity to the situation that even Custer couldn't ignore. Despite these concerns, Custer remained focused on the task ahead. He believed that with the right timing and execution, his plan would still succeed. The 7th Cavalry had faced tough odds before, and Custer was confident that they would prevail once again. As the camp quieted down for the night, Custer prepared himself for the battle that lay ahead. Tomorrow would be the day of reckoning, a day that would determine the outcome of the entire campaign.